In one of my recent videos, I discussed ultra-wide photography, and I gave tips on how to shoot ultra-wide photos. But when it comes to editing ultra-wide photos, other than using presets or editing the way you want, there is a technique that I use personally to make your ultra-wide photos pop or make them more exaggerated. And the way I do this is basically by adding contrast to the foreground. When it comes to ultra-wide photography, I personally love to add foreground to my photos. As you can see here in these 3 photos that I have handpicked today for this tutorial, you can see that there is foreground in all 3 of them, whether it's rocks, whether it is pebbles, whether it is just a giant rock. How do we make these images pop off? All right, so let's hop right into Lightroom and let's get started on these photos. Now, these photos have already been edited with presets that I have used before, and they're already pretty much looking good and kind of done. But there is something that feels missing when it comes to these photos. It is the technique that I use to make these images look, in my opinion, better. The first thing I do when it comes to these kinds of photos is because there's always pretty much a foreground element and the sky element and the subject. These are usually the 3 pillars of my ultra-wide photography. Now, we hit the masking button right here. We select the sky. That is the first step. And when it comes to selecting the sky, it pretty much does a great job with the new AI features. Now, the first thing I like to do is to lower the highlights just to bring a bit of color back into the sky. I don't want to go too much just because the subject starts to look a bit off. So I just want to lower it just a tiny bit. Now, here comes the trick. To select your foreground, what you do is you right click and you hit duplicate and invert. But this also selects your subject, which is something you probably don't want to do. So how do we fix this? We hit the subtract right here, objects, and we just make a selection over our subject. And the AI will do a great job in this case in subtracting the subject from our mask. Now, how do we add contrast to the foreground elements? There's several ways. Here's my favorites. The first thing that you can do simply is by sliding the contrast slider. And that is not a bad thing. It is a good thing, but as you can see, it becomes a bit too dark. I like to have more manual control when it comes to adding my contrast. So the way I do this is by increasing the highlights, increasing the shadows also, but dropping my blacks and crushing those blacks just a tiny bit, and upping my whites also a tiny bit. Now, here's the difference. Before, after. Already huge difference. Now, how do we add more contrast, or how do we make it pop even more? Well, with the new masking features, now we have curves. So as you can see here in this mask right here, there's not a lot of highlights. And you can see here with this graph here in the background, you can see there's a lot of shadows, but not a lot of highlights. So most of our work will be in this area right here. So now what we can do is we can make a few points right around here. And what we can do is we can maybe increase the highlights by holding also the Alt button. You can make minor adjustments, and you can also drop the shadows just a bit. And let's see the difference. So this is without and this is with. You can still see everything we do just piles on top of each other, and it makes this photo just way different than it used to be. Now, if you feel like you've crushed the blacks a bit too much or the shadows are a bit too dark, what you can do is you can simply go back to your blacks and just kind of adjust that or tweak it a little bit. Now, the secret sauce when it comes to adding contrast in your foreground is the clarity slider. Now, you don't want to go way too hard on this. You just want to do a bit of clarity just to make it pop just a little bit. So simply with this one simple mask for the foreground, we went from this to this. Now, the last thing you want to do is have a mask on your subject himself. So here we show the overlay, and here you can do any adjustment that you feel makes sense. You can increase the shadows, but that kind of makes him washed out. You can even decrease the shadows and make him a silhouette, and that also can, change your photo completely. But it is up to you what you do in this mask. So that is for the first photo. Let's jump into the second photo, and we will follow the same steps and techniques. In the second photo here, we have our foreground element, which are the pebbles. We have our subject, and we have the sky. Now, first things first, we select the sky. The sky is already pretty well exposed. The colors already look great. Let's see what happens if we reset this mask here. What happens if we drop the highlights? We get a little bit more color and saturation in the photo. Now, duplicate and invert this mask. Now you've selected your foreground, but you've also selected your subject and you've selected the water here. So what you can simply do is you can subtract, you can grab a brush, make your brush a bit bigger, and just remove your subject and remove the water from your mask. And that way you've just selected the pebbles themselves. Now, because we've selected the pebbles, we need to add contrast into these pebbles. First thing we can notice is that it is too dark. Now, in this case, I'm gonna increase my shadows, increase my highlights just a bit, which is these like light here on the corner of these pebbles. I'm gonna drop the blacks a bit to add more contrast, and I'm gonna up my whites a bit. I'm even gonna increase my exposure just a tiny bit, just to give it this feel that, you know, I'm using an ultra wide lens and there's details in the rocks and they're leading me towards my subject. All right, now next thing is the graph. I'm gonna drop the shadows a bit, increase from here, and I'm gonna increase the clarity in my rocks. Now, one thing you can also do is you can make a linear gradient, and you can make a selection here, and you can see it selects most of the rocks, and if you drop it down a bit and make this longer, it feathers it even more. Drop this down even more, and what you can do is you can even just darken the first few rocks, and that way you have more light in the following ones. Just a little touch that I like to do just to make things unique and different. But yeah, so basically we went from this foreground to this foreground, and for me this is much better. Third quick example is this photo right here of Anthony jumping. So first step is we select our sky. The sky here is also pretty well exposed. Let's reset this and let's drop the highlights just a tiny bit. Duplicate and invert the mask. Now we've selected everything here. And what we can do is subtract, select an object, and let us subtract our subject. And even let's try to subtract the sun right here if possible. Now the AI is going to have a hard time doing this. You can do it manually with a brush, but for this video I'm not going to do that. Now remove the show overlay and let us start adding some contrast in our foreground. Now the first thing we notice is because it is a silhouette and I'm shooting directly into the sun, we have a sun flare, I'm shooting at f/22. It is very dark. So honestly, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna just increase the exposure itself almost by a full stop. I'm gonna increase the shadows, drop the blacks, up the whites a bit, and the highlights. The highlights are gonna make the sun rays even, you know, stronger. Now, I feel like this is too much visibility, which is something I don't really want. I just want light around this area right here. I don't want light around this tree. So I'm gonna just drop the shadows back again. Go down here to the curves, make a point, and I can make a point even here because we do have a bit of highlights. So this will basically affect our highlights, as you can see, which is the sun rays here. I want them to be even brighter. I'm gonna drop down the shadows, which are or the dark parts of this image, and I'm gonna up the midtones just a bit. Now we do have a lot of blue in this rock right here. You can head to the blue section of the curves, and honestly what you can do is you can basically just drop down the blue, and there you go. You pretty much got rid of the blue and you added a bit of yellow and change the temperature a bit if it's something that you want to do. You can also bring this back up, and you can also bring this even further down. Now I don't really want to do that. I'm just gonna keep the blue right now, and I'm gonna focus on adding contrast. Last thing to do is just the clarity slider, just a tiny bit. Now we do have a lot of blue in the shadows. Just go here to your color grading, and honestly what you can do is you can maybe change your shadows to maybe a lighter color instead of blue, and that will counteract the blue over here. But yeah, we went from this to this. My opinion, much better, makes the photo look way nicer. But yeah, that is it for this technique. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Try it the next time you take photos with foreground or maybe using an ultra wide lens. Let me know what you think. See you guys in the next one. Bye.